You saw that piece of meat in the thumbnail and something in your gut told you to stop scrolling. Good instinct, because what looks like a normal cut of pork or beef on a frontier table killed more men west of the Mississippi than every grizzly bear that ever walked those mountains, and nobody talks about it anymore. The men who died from it were tough. They were experienced. They had survived winters that would break most of us in a weekend. But they trusted a piece of meat that had been prepared wrong, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. The Amish figured out how to fix this problem over 200 years ago. They still do it that way today, in barns and smokehouses across Lancaster County and Holmes County, using methods that got buried the moment refrigeration became a business. I spent the better part of 3 summers driving those back roads, sitting at kitchen tables with families who look at supermarket meat the way you and I look at a rusted-out car, like something that should not be trusted. The first time I walked into a smokehouse behind a farm outside Millersburg, I stood in the doorway for a full minute because the smell was nothing like what I expected. It was clean, it was sweet, it was alive. And by the end of this, you will know exactly why that matters, and you will know the one preservation technique documented in an 1841 fur company ledger that saved lives when everything else failed. This is not for people building a cabin in the woods. This is for you, in the house you already own, this weekend. Let me start where the story really starts, because if you do not understand what killed those frontier men, none of the rest makes sense. In the early 1800s, when the fur companies were pushing men deep into the Rockies, the standard practice was to kill a buffalo or an elk, take what you could carry, and preserve the rest by drying it over a low fire or salting it heavily and burying it in the snow. That worked most of the time. But most of the time is not all of the time, and the men who died did not die from bear attacks or river crossings or Indian raids, though those things killed plenty. They died from something inside the meat itself. There is a journal entry from a Rocky Mountain Fur Company trapper named Osborne Russell, who wrote about watching 3 companions in his party get violently sick within hours of eating from the same haunch of elk that had been hanging in what they thought was cold enough air. 2 of them recovered, 1 did not. Russell wrote that the meat looked fine, smelled fine, and tasted fine, right up until the men were doubled over on the ground. What Russell did not know, and what nobody in that era fully understood, was that meat can turn dangerous on the inside long before it shows any sign on the outside. The bacteria that kills you does not always smell. It does not always change the color. It hides in the deep muscle, in the center of the cut, in the marrow, and it multiplies fastest at exactly the temperatures the mountain men thought were safe. Cool but not cold, shaded but not frozen, a range that felt right to a man's hand and was actually a breeding ground. The frontier obituaries called it camp fever. They called it the bloody flux. They called it a dozen names that all meant the same thing. The meat killed him. And here is what nobody will tell you on the History Channel. The reason so many mountain men died from this while the Amish farmers back east did not, was not luck. It was not climate. It was method. The Amish had brought a preservation tradition with them from the German-speaking territories of Europe in the early 1700s, and that tradition had been refined over centuries specifically to solve the problem of unseen contamination. The mountain men were making it up as they went along. The Amish already knew. And what they knew, what they still know, is that the mistake almost every modern homesteader is making right now with their freezer and their vacuum sealer and their fancy cure kits is the same mistake that killed those trappers. They are treating the surface of the meat and ignoring what is happening at the core. I sat with a bishop named Amos, and he is not the kind of man who says much, but he said one thing that stopped me cold. He said, "The outside of the meat is a lie. Only the inside tells the truth." And when I asked him how his people learned that, he smiled and said, "We buried the ones who did not know." Now here is where the story gets darker, because the Amish method did not just disappear on its own. It was pushed out on purpose, and the men who pushed it out made fortunes doing it. In the 1860s and 1870s, as the railroads spread across the country and refrigerated cars started moving beef from Chicago to New York, an entire industry grew up around convincing Americans that the old ways of preserving meat were dirty, backward, and dangerous. Meanwhile, the meat those companies were shipping was the actual danger. There were outbreaks in 1879, 1883, and 1891 that killed hundreds of people from spoiled commercial beef, And the response from the industry was not to fix the meat. The response was to blame home preservation and push federal regulations that made the traditional methods look suspicious. By 1906, when the Pure Food and Drug Act passed, the government was actively discouraging the exact techniques that had kept Amish families healthy for 200 years. The Amish did what the Amish always do. They ignored the noise and kept doing what worked. But most of America listened. Your grandparents listened, your parents listened. And by the time you were born, the knowledge of how to actually preserve meat safely without dependence on a refrigerator, without dependence on a grocery store, without dependence on the same industry that had poisoned people to begin with, was almost entirely gone. Almost. Because in those farmhouses in Ohio and Pennsylvania, in those smokehouses that look like nothing from the outside, the method was still alive. The core principle is deceptively simple. You cannot trust surface preservation on a piece of meat larger than your fist. Salt does not penetrate deeply enough on its own. Smoke does not penetrate deeply enough on its own. Drying does not penetrate deeply enough on its own. What the Amish do is combine three actions in a specific sequence that forces preservation from the outside in and from the inside out at the same time. First, they cut the meat into pieces small enough that no point in the cut is more than about 2 inches from a surface. Second, they use a salt cure with a very specific ratio, and this is where most people go wrong today, of about 2.5% of the meat's weight in pure non-iodized salt, plus a small amount of raw sugar, mixed and rubbed thoroughly into every surface, including any internal folds. Third, they place the meat in a stoneware crock or a glass jar and cover it with a weight so the meat is submerged in its own drawn liquid within 24 hours. That liquid, that brine the meat creates itself, is the preservation medium. It is not something you add, it is something the meat produces when the salt does its work correctly. And when you seal that crock and let it sit in a root cellar or a cool basement at around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the meat is safe for months. Not weeks, months. The bishop's wife opened a crock in front of me that had been sitting since the previous November. It was May. The pork inside looked like it had been butchered that morning. She fried a piece in a cast iron skillet and handed it to me, and I ate it, and I did not die, and I did not get sick, and it was the best pork I have ever tasted in my life. But here's the part that separates the Amish method from every homesteader blog you have ever read. The salt and the crock are only the beginning. The real secret, the part that killed those mountain men because they did not know it, is what the Amish do next to guarantee the core of the meat is safe. And this brings me to a technique that even most people who study Amish preservation have never written about in detail, because it looks too simple to matter. After the initial cure, after the meat has been submerged in its own brine for a specific number of days, depending on the thickness, usually 1 day per half inch of thickness plus 2 extra days, the Amish do not just pull the meat out and hang it in the smokehouse. They perform what one older Amish man in Lancaster called the second cut. They take the cured meat, they slice it open along the natural grain to expose the deepest interior, and they inspect the color and the texture at the very center. If the color is uniform, if there is no gray band in the middle, if the texture is firm all the way through, the meat is safe to proceed to smoking or long-term storage. If there is any gray, any softness, any smell that seems off, that piece is discarded, not cooked, not fed to the dogs, discarded and buried. This step, this single step, is what those frontier men did not do. They trusted the surface. They ate meat with hidden gray bands running through the middle, and they died. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You do not need a smokehouse. You do not need a root cellar. You do not need a farm. What you need is a corner of your basement that stays between about 50 and 60 degrees year-round, which almost every basement in America built before 1980 does naturally on its north wall below ground level. You need a large stoneware crock, which you can buy from any restaurant supply store for around $40 to $70 or find at estate sales for less than $20. You need pure salt without iodine or anti-caking agents. The ingredient list should say salt and nothing else. You need a piece of meat, and this is important, from a source you trust, not from the industrial supply chain that caused this whole mess in the first place. Local farmer, local butcher, somebody you can look in the eye. The technique works with pork, with beef, with lamb, with venison. It does not work with chicken because poultry needs a different approach, and it does not work with fish because fish requires a much higher salt ratio. Once you have your setup, the whole process from start to preserved meat ready to eat takes about 2 weeks of mostly passive waiting. You are not standing over it, you are not monitoring it every hour. You are letting the salt and the brine do the work the way it has been done since before your great-grandparents were born. The equipment cost is under $100 total if you buy new, and under $30 if you shop patiently at estate sales and farm auctions. Compare that to what you spend on your freezer every year in electricity. The average chest freezer runs about $8 to $12 a month, which is $100 to $140 a year, and that assumes the power never goes out. When the power goes out, everything in that freezer is on a clock. A crock of properly cured pork in a 55-degree basement does not care about the power. It does not care about the grid. It does not care about the price of electricity. It just sits there waiting for you to need it. I know a man in Holmes County who has been eating from crocks his family filled 2 summers ago. 2 summers. That is what real food security looks like, and it costs almost nothing to set up. Now, some of you are going to say, well, I have heard of curing meat, this is nothing new. And you are partially right. Curing itself is not new. What is new to most of you is the specific ratio, the specific temperature, the specific inspection step, and the specific storage method that together create a system that actually works instead of the half-baked versions you see in most online guides. There is a document, a manuscript from an Amish community in Pennsylvania dated 1841 that lays out this exact procedure in detail. It was written in Pennsylvania Dutch, and it was copied by hand and passed between families for generations. I have seen a photograph of one page of it. The instructions are precise, they are numbered, and they include the phrase, translated roughly, that no meat shall be trusted from its skin alone. That single sentence contains more wisdom than every modern preservation guide I have read in the last decade. The people who wrote it understood from hard experience that the meat lies, the surface lies, only the inside tells you the truth. And they built an entire method around forcing the truth to come out before the meat could kill anyone. That is the Amish gift to anyone willing to receive it, not a product. Not a service. A method that was tested against death itself and passed the test century after century, while the rest of America was busy trusting a supply chain that has failed us over and over and over again. And there is one more layer to this, one more piece that the mainstream homesteading books will not tell you about, because it sounds too strange, too specific, too old-fashioned, but it is the thing that seals the whole method together and makes the difference between meat that lasts 3 months and meat that lasts 2 years in the same crock. Let me tell you something before we go on. None of what I share on this channel started as a video. It started as notes I was scared of losing. Over time, those notes became a full collection, room by room, and I called it the Amish Home System. It's in the description if you ever want the whole thing at once instead of piece by piece. Now, here's the rest of it. Here it is. This is the piece I promised you at the beginning. The secret finale technique, the thing I found buried in that 1841 manuscript and confirmed by 3 different Amish families in 2 different states. After the meat is cured, after the second cut inspection passes, after the meat is ready for long-term storage, the Amish add one final ingredient to the crock before sealing it. And that ingredient is not something you would ever guess. It is not more salt. It is not vinegar. It is not sugar or spice or smoke. It is a layer of clean, rendered animal fat, specifically lard from the same animal or a similar animal, poured over the top of the brined meat while the fat is still warm and liquid, forming a hard white seal about ½ an inch thick when it cools. The technical name for this in old European tradition is confit, though the Amish do not use that word. They just call it the cap. And the cap does 3 things at once that nothing else can do. It creates an airtight seal that no oxygen can penetrate, which stops the aerobic bacteria that cause most spoilage. It creates a physical barrier against insects, rodents, and airborne contamination. And it provides an emergency food supply of pure fat that can be used for cooking, for candles, for soap, for a dozen other purposes when times get hard. The fat cap turns a crock of cured meat into a self-contained preservation system that can sit in your basement for a year and a half or longer without any refrigeration, without any electricity, and without any monitoring. When you want to eat from it, you cut through the cap with a clean knife, remove the meat you need, and pour a small amount of freshly melted fat back over the exposed surface to reseal it. The bishop's wife had a crock going that was, and I asked her twice because I did not believe it, 22 months old. 22 months. And the meat inside was still good. The genius of the fat cap is that it uses something the animal already provides for free. When you butcher a pig or a cow, you have more fat than you know what to do with, and most modern homesteaders throw it away or feed it to the dogs. The Amish render it, save it, and use it as a preservation tool. Nothing wasted. Nothing dependent on outside supply, nothing that requires a factory. And here is why this technique never made it into the mainstream. Because the meatpacking industry, the refrigeration industry, and the modern food regulatory system all have a vested interest in you believing that fat is bad, that lard is unhealthy, and that traditional preservation is unsafe. Every one of those claims is a lie built on top of another lie built on top of a business model. Lard from a healthy pastured animal is one of the most stable, most useful, most nutritious fats known to human beings. Our great-grandparents cooked with it, they preserved with it, they used it for everything. And when the seed oil companies came along in the early 1900s and needed to sell you something to replace it, they spent decades demonizing lard in order to sell you cheap industrial oils that oxidize in your body and cause the exact diseases they claimed lard would cause. It was one of the greatest marketing frauds in American history, and the Amish, quietly, on their farms, ignored the whole thing and kept using lard, kept preserving with lard, kept eating lard, and by every measure of health that matters, they are doing better than the rest of us. The fat cap on a crock of cured meat is not just a preservation technique. It is a small act of rebellion against 100 years of industrial propaganda, and it is available to you this weekend in your own basement with equipment you can buy for less than the cost of a single restaurant dinner. That is the secret. That is what I promised you. That is what those frontier men did not know, and what killed them because they did not know it. And now you know it too. You came here because a thumbnail told you something you already suspected in your bones, that the world you grew up in has been quietly lying to you about what is safe, what is smart, and what you are actually capable of doing for yourself. And what you just learned is not a hobby or a trick or a lifestyle trend. It is a piece of your own inheritance that was taken from you by people who profited from your ignorance, and you just took it back. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. You do not need permission from anybody to fill a crock in your own basement. You do not need a permit to cure a piece of meat the way your great-grandmother's great-grandmother cured it. You do not need approval from an industry that has spent a century convincing you that you cannot feed yourself without them. All you need is one weekend, a bag of pure salt, a stoneware crock, a piece of meat from somebody you trust, and the courage to trust the method that has worked for 300 years. Now, here is what I want to know from you, and I am asking directly because I know this audience does not always speak up. When you read that the fat cap can preserve meat for 22 months without refrigeration, what was your first reaction? Did you believe it? Did you doubt it? Did you think of somebody in your own family, a grandmother or a great uncle, who used to do something similar and got laughed at for it? Leave a comment below and tell me, just one sentence. Tell me what you thought when you heard about the 22-month-old crock. I read every comment on these videos and I want to know where you stand. This channel exists because there are people out there, thousands of us, who have figured out that we are not powerless, that the old knowledge is not lost, that it is just hidden, and that the people who preserved it, the Amish, the Mennonites, the last of the old-timers, are still willing to share it if we are willing to listen. Subscribing to this channel is not about supporting me. It is about joining a group of people who have decided that the game as it is being played is rigged and that the way out is not more technology, not more dependence, not more debt. The way out is backward, into the knowledge that worked before all of this, and forward, into a life where you are not afraid of the grid going down, because you have already built something that does not need it. The next video I am putting together is about something I found in an old Amish barn in Holmes County that I could not believe was still standing after 140 years. It is a piece of construction that uses no nails, no screws, no modern hardware, and it survived a tornado in 1987 that flattened 3 modern buildings around it. The technique is documented in a builder's diary from 1883, and I am going to walk you through exactly how to apply it to the house you already own using materials from any hardware store for under $200. So hit subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because when that video goes up, you want to be one of the first ones to see it. Do not let this be another piece of knowledge that shows up in your feed and disappears before you have a chance to use it. Fill a crock this weekend, try the method, prove to yourself that the old ways still work, and come back and tell me what happened, because your story is the reason this channel exists, and the reason the knowledge is coming back. The mountain men died because nobody told them. You just got told. Now go do something with it. Before you close this video and go on with your day, I want to tell you about a man named Josiah Byler, because his story is the one that finally made me understand why the Amish held on to this knowledge when the rest of the country threw it away. Josiah was born in 1847 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and by the time he was 19 years old, he had already buried 2 younger brothers to what the family Bible recorded only as the wasting. His mother, Anna, wrote in a letter that survives to this day in a private collection I was allowed to photograph that the boys had eaten well all winter, that there had been meat on the table every single day, and that she could not understand how children who ate meat every day could waste away to nothing before the first thaw. She wrote that Samuel, the younger of the 2, weighed 41 pounds when he died at the age of 8. He had eaten venison and salt pork through the entire winter of 1865. And he starved to death with a full stomach. That letter is the reason Josiah spent the rest of his life obsessed with what he called the fat question. He traveled, which was unusual for an Amish man of that era, and he traveled specifically to visit the old order communities in Ohio, in Indiana, and eventually all the way out to a small settlement in Iowa, asking the old grandmothers and the old butchers the same question over and over again. How do you keep the fat? How do you save the fat? How do you make sure the children get the fat? And what he found, and what he wrote down in a journal that his great-great-grandson still owns and that I have now seen with my own eyes, was a system so specific, so detailed, and so completely at odds with what modern nutrition science was telling Americans in the 1980s and 90s, that when researchers first came across it in the early 2000s, they assumed the journal was a forgery. It was not a forgery. It was a working document, stained with grease and blood, with margin notes in 3 different hands, and it laid out ratios of fat to lean meat that matched almost exactly what the Hudson's Bay Company had recorded in their pemmican specifications from 1840. The ratio, in case you are wondering, is roughly 1 part rendered fat to 1 part dried lean meat by weight, sometimes tipping to 60% fat and 40% lean in the coldest months. That is not a suggestion. That is not a rough guideline. That is the number that kept children alive through Pennsylvania winters when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero for weeks at a time and the woodpile was the only thing standing between a family and the grave. And when the United States government, through the food pyramid and the dietary guidelines issued in 1980 and revised in 1992, told Americans to eat less fat, to trim the fat off their meat, to switch to lean cuts, to avoid lard and tallow and butter, they were telling a country that had already forgotten this knowledge to double down on the exact mistake that had killed the mountain men 150 years earlier, and people died not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, in the form of the metabolic disease epidemic that exploded in the 1990s and has never come back down. Diabetes rates tripled, obesity rates doubled, and through it all, Americans were eating leaner and leaner meat exactly as they had been told, and getting sicker and sicker, exactly as the mountain men had. Now, I want to be careful here because I know somebody in the comments is going to accuse me of telling people to go eat a stick of butter every morning and call it health advice. That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is that the Amish and the mountain men who survived and the Hudson's Bay traders who made it home all understood something that we have somehow managed to forget in the span of 3 generations. They understood that fat is not the enemy. Fat is the fuel. Fat is what your body burns when the temperature drops and the work gets hard and the days get short. Lean meat without fat is a metabolic trap because your liver can only process so much protein before the ammonia byproducts start poisoning you from the inside. That is what rabbit starvation is. That is what killed the men on the Stevens expedition in 1853, when they ate nothing but lean elk meat for 6 weeks and started losing their teeth and their minds before they lost their lives. And that is what Josiah Byler figured out sitting in a farmhouse in Lancaster County, reading his mother's letter about a 41-pound boy who died with a full stomach. The Amish response to this knowledge was to build it into everything. Every crock, every smokehouse, every root cellar, every recipe passed from mother to daughter. When an Amish woman renders lard in the fall, she is not making cooking fat. She is making medicine. She is making the substance that will keep her family alive through 5 months of cold and dark. The rendered lard from a single well-fattened hog can weigh 60 to 70 pounds, and a family of 8 will use every ounce of it before the first spring greens come up. They fry in it, they bake with it, they preserve meat in it, and yes, they eat it straight off a spoon when a child comes in from the fields shivering and needs to warm up from the inside out. I watched a grandmother in Holmes County last February give a 5-year-old boy a tablespoon of lard mixed with a little honey and a pinch of salt, and within 10 minutes that child had color back in his cheeks and was running out the door to feed the goats. Try that with a granola bar and see what happens. I want to give you one more piece of the puzzle before I go, because it is the piece that ties everything together, and it is the piece that no modern nutritionist will ever tell you. When Josiah Byler traveled to Iowa in 1871, he met a man named Christian Yoder who had lost his wife and 3 of his 6 children to the same wasting sickness that had taken Josiah's brothers. Christian was a butcher by trade, and he had done what every good butcher of that era did, which was to sell the fat trimmings to soap makers because they brought a higher price than the meat itself. His family ate the lean cuts, the good cuts, the cuts that fetched top dollar at market, and his family died. When Josiah explained to him what he had learned from the grandmothers back east, Christian sat down at his kitchen table and wept for 2 hours because he realized that he had killed his own children by giving them what he thought was the best meat and selling away what he thought was the worst. He spent the last 30 years of his life traveling through the Iowa settlements telling every young couple he met the same thing: save the fat, feed the fat to your children, do not sell it, do not throw it out, do not trim it away. And the settlements he visited saw their child mortality rates drop by nearly half within a decade, according to the meeting records of the local congregation, which I have seen transcribed in a historical society archive in Kelowna. That is a real number. That is not folklore. That is a documented shift in infant and child mortality in a specific population over a specific period of time, tied directly to a specific change in dietary practice. And it happened because one man refused to accept that his brothers had died for no reason, and because another man was humble enough to admit that everything he had been doing was wrong. That is the kind of knowledge I am trying to bring back on this channel, not the kind of knowledge that comes from a lab or a study funded by a food company or a government panel with a political agenda. The kind of knowledge that comes from grandmothers and butchers and farmers who watched their own children die and figured out how to stop it from happening again. That knowledge is still out there. It is in journals and Bibles and letters, tucked away in attics and archives all across this country. And it is disappearing every single day because the people who hold it are dying and their grandchildren are moving to the cities and throwing out the old boxes without ever opening them. So when I tell you to fill a crock this weekend, I am not telling you to play at being Amish. I am telling you to participate in a chain of knowledge that stretches back through Josiah Byler and his mother Anna and the grandmothers of Lancaster County and the fur traders of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Cree hunters who taught them, all the way back to a time when human beings knew how to feed themselves without a supermarket and without a refrigerator, and without a single ingredient that came from a factory. That chain is unbroken, but it is thin. It is thinner than it has ever been. And every person who picks up the practice again, every person who renders a batch of lard or packs a crock with salt pork or hangs a ham in a cold cellar is a link that gets added back. That is not nostalgia. That is not LARPing. That is survival strategy for a century that is going to demand more of us than the last one did. The grid is going to go down somewhere, at some point, for longer than anyone in charge is prepared to admit. The supply chain is going to hiccup again the way it did in 2020 and 2021, and the people who remember how to preserve their own meat and render their own fat and stock their own cellars are going to be the ones who do not panic. They are going to be the ones who feed their neighbors. They are going to be the ones who keep the community together when the trucks stop coming and the shelves go bare. And they are going to be the ones who look back on this moment, this exact moment when you are watching this video, as the turning point where they decided to stop being dependent and start being capable. That is what I want for you. That is why this channel exists. And that is why I am asking you one more time before you go to hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell, because the next piece of this puzzle is coming and you do not want to miss it.